what everyone's talking about is immigration. Someone told me recently that basically, like, this isn't where the fight is. And so we were having a talk, and I basically came back and said, look, this has to be where the fight is, right? This idea that your fight has to be where the rest of the people are going is a fraud. My fight has never been where the rest of the people are going. Whenever I'm fighting for something or trying to stand up for something, what inevitably ends up happening, even if it's not particularly what I want, is I'm running, I go to fight for something, here's the people fighting, and inevitably I ended up running out there in front and staying focused, and the people behind me get pissed off because I'm not doing it the way they told me to. This happened when I ran for Congress. This happened in the Patriot movement. This happened when I was a leader of the Second Amendment movement. And I always said to these people, this isn't about the Second Amendment. This isn't about the Fourth Amendment. This isn't about Republicans. This isn't about Democrats or Libertarians. Your parties don't matter. Of course, that never goes over well. Your church denominations don't matter. The church is not actually being Christian. If we're talking about, the Christian church, the church is a business, wearing long robes and platitudes, pretending they're Christian, and that the goal needs to be evangelizing people and building the church, when really what they're trying to do is build their bank accounts. Some of them don't even know this. They've just been so brainwashed into this. This goes to the rather deep things we were talking about the live stream the other day of how programmed our brains are, not only from how we were raised and how we behave, but just our current situation, and how the neurons of our brain can actually change, and it can happen very quickly. And to not become programmed, you have to actively unprogram yourself. And if this gets into kind of neuroscience, and as well as self-help type stuff like Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself and books like that get into this stuff. But when people say, it's all about faith for me, it's all about Jesus, it's all about this, it's all about the blood, it's all about patriotism, it's all about freedom. Whenever you take a line, and this is something I've seen a lot lately, whenever you take a line, which in these times is usually a meme also, a saying, a quote. Not that being inspired by a quote is necessarily bad, but have you noticed that people, for example, debating the complete destruction of due process, the complete destruction of the Constitution in these times, the absolute abuse of the 4th, 5th, 6th, 9th, 10th Amendment, Article 1, human rights, God-given rights, natural law, God's law, wherever you want to come at it from, everybody's making excuses for abusing their fellow man. And so what happens is I always end up saying, hold on, I'm with you guys on your rights. I was right there. I was on the phone with Lavoy Finicum just a few days before he died. I was on a call with people watching all over the world trying to get the Final Four off the refuge without a gunfight, without the FBI murdering them like they did to Lavoy Finicum. I was supporting the natives at Standing Rock. I was supporting the Bundys and their rancher rights. I opposed the police because they're criminals and they don't represent the law. This is the law in the United States if you want to be codified, but the law in reality is our rights. I don't bow down to the Romans 13 church who's selling themselves and whoring themselves out to the government so that they can get their tax write-offs and make more money and tickle people's ears. Romans 13 doesn't say obey the whims of criminal politicians. It's talking about obeying the laws of the land, the laws of nature, the laws of life, liberty and property, respecting your fellow man, and not being a lawless person. Being a lawful person or a lawless person has nothing to do with the codes that government writes. Now, as peace-loving people, I think you should try and get along in the culture and be adaptable. Just like me, here I am in Mexico, right? And there's some things that I'm like, well, that seems dumb. And there's some things that I'll say, that's a violation of my rights. No, you're not searching my car. Screw off, just like I did in the US. And there's some things that I'll be like, hey, I'm the immigrant here. I need to be open-minded and try and adapt to the culture here. You can have all of that. That's called using your brain and trying to be wise and trying to be understanding, trying to be compassionate, trying to care about other people, and trying not to be stuck in your own ways. But I've never seen people more stuck in their ways, I don't think, than people from the US. This brought up a topic, because of course, as always lately, we were talking about this immigration, and well, they need to follow the law, they need to come here legally, and there was a discussion, there was a rather, I won't show the screens, but I was actually having, and this is rare, this is why it caught my eye, somebody was actually having a fairly sane discussion with me, right? Because most of the time when I post reality and facts, I defend the immigrant, I post the law, I post this article right here, which absolutely wastes all the arguments they make. Every argument that's on all the memes is all here. I'll put a link. Most of you won't read it. In this discussion with this person who I felt like, is kind of struggling with this whole we can't have open borders, he sent me this video of this guy, Mike Winger, right? So I was watching this video, not because I needed more information or I needed some guy's biblical perspective, because the Bible is really clear on this as well. But what struck me about this video is this guy was going through, and he was trying to be kind of neutral, Christian neutral, right? And trying not to lose his audience, because most of the so-called Christians hate their neighbor with a passion. They hate the other party with a passion. They hate the law with a passion. They hate the Constitution with a passion. And most of all, they hate the immigrant with a passion. Not because any of these things did anything to them, but because they're repeating the propaganda of who they actually worship, which is Trump, the state, their party, their faction, etc. It's definitely not Jesus, because the definition of being a Christian is not how much you go to church or read the Bible or how pious you are, or whether you follow the church rules of whatever dumb rules your denomination invented. Being a Christian is trying to be like Christ. Now, we don't have to get into the theology of that. This isn't really a theology channel. I usually discuss more civic matters. But I was watching this video, and he was talking about immigration, and this guy didn't know much about the laws of immigration.
This is the thrust in Scripture. 36-something times it says something along these lines. God really...
But what I noticed is that he wasn't raving against the immigrants. He was like, I have people that are, illegal, which I cringe when I hear that word, because there's no such thing. But he goes through it, and every verse he finds, every verse this Mike Winger guy finds, is talking about how you have to treat the foreigner and the immigrant with respect. You have to treat them equal to the citizen. And then he would bring up these little things, and this is, of course, in ancient Hebrew law, right? Which is not what we're under. But if you're trying to find examples, right, you can find all kinds of New Testament examples of Christ saying you have to love your neighbor as yourself, and that is the law and the prophets. That's how you please God. Now, I know people might debate about what loving your neighbor as yourself is, but it's certainly not rounding them up, sending them to concentration camps, death camps, taking away from their families, taking everything they have, sending them away to poor countries, sending them back to countries they're refugees from to be murdered, or murdering them yourself. None of those things, equivocally, none of those things are loving your neighbor as yourself. Good to see you guys in there. Appreciate it. And so I'm watching this video, and I'll even link this video if you guys want, and you can check it out if you want. Now, what was interesting to me is I listened to it because it wasn't foaming at the mouth. Even though this person was very ignorant on legal stuff. He was doing the whole Romans 13 thing, all the propaganda that the churches have programmed us with, and the government ultimately, because there's very little difference. But the irony of that is he didn't actually understand the law or the Constitution, and almost no one does. The lawyers don't even talk about this, even though it's super simple and super clear. So even if you took Romans 13 in its mainstream modern government worshiping state where it said, obey the government. That's basically how you translate it. Obey the government, obey the police, obey the laws they wrote. In the United States, this is still the law. Now, I realize it's being blatantly ignored and destroyed as we speak. But every immigration restriction is a violation of the Constitution. The government has absolutely zero authority to control immigration, granted in the Constitution. And under that, Remember that the whole concept of the Constitution is they can only do what's in here. It's not just a prohibition of you can't violate these rights. They can only carry out the activities. And so you could say, well, the socialism's draining us. Okay, that's not the immigrants' fault, but fine. Here's the thing. The socialism isn't authorized in this either. The government's not supposed to be taking your money and redistribute it. And I said this earlier today to somebody who is peddling the propaganda in the name of being a conservative patriot, which is BS. I said the U.S. is not they were talking about capitalism and how great capitalism was. I said the U.S. is not a capitalistic country. The U.S. is a socialist country. When you have capitalism, you have the right to move, the right to travel, the right to enter, the right to exit, and the right to free trade, which is literally the opposite of what you have right now. And so if you go through this, and you go to even to the 10th Amendment, and it says anything not delegated to the United States government by this Constitution is prohibited. It's clear as day. The government has zero authority. So all of the immigration laws, and I mean all of them. And so people are like, oh, well, what about the Alien and Sedition Acts? And I'm like, are you guys kidding me? Now people are so ignorant that at this point, they're quoting the Alien and Sedition Acts, which are one of the most unconstitutional acts and were immediately denounced by many of the states, the leaders of the states, and people who wrote the Constitution. This was John Adams' worst hour. And John Adams was always a little bit of a, big government needs to be respected kind of guy. And these guys made it clear. And people are like, oh no, the Alien Seditions. You have the courts hundreds of years later upholding the Alien Enemies Act and things that were in the Alien and Friends and the Alien Sedition Acts. Guys, these things were illegal. And this is the problem. Like, people say, oh, these judges are rogue. Well, yes, they are rogue, but it's not because they're demanding that people be taken back out of a prison they were illegally sent to be given due process. For once, they're kind of doing their job. But in general, the Supreme Courts, whether it was the slavery or the Alien Sedition Acts, are constantly upholding tyranny. That's what the Supreme Court has mostly done for most of its career. Okay, so they're always saying, follow the law, follow the law. Let's actually look. I won't read this whole article, but this is my entire trove that I've spent years building. That's everything that no one will tell you about the immigration and history of it. Okay? But let's look. The power vested in the Constitution by Congress. This is the founding fathers that said this stuff, right? This is the first Congress. The power vested by the Constitution in Congress extends to nothing more than making a uniform rule of naturalization. People use the Naturalization Act constantly as an argument. They don't even care that you prove them wrong. Naturalization very clearly has nothing to do with immigration. It was the act of becoming a citizen. That's not open for debate. It's in the dictionary. It was in the original texts. It was in the conversations. It's not even a discussion. Legally, that is. Okay? But let's come to when people keep quoting the Alien Act. Here's how these guys responded to it. Jefferson, in regards to the Alien Act of 1798, every act of delegated authority, contrary to the tenor and commission under which it is exercised, is void. No legislative act, therefore, contrary to the Constitution, can be valid. That's Federalist 78, before the Constitution. Now you come after the Constitution to the 1798. The act of Congress, which assumes powers over alien friends not delegated by the Constitution, is not law, but is altogether void and of no force. That was Thomas Jefferson. Do you guys understand the level? People act like I'm a radical. These people were so clear about this stuff that the government had absolutely no power over it. There are no legal immigration laws. That means ICE is a criminal, violent organization. And by the entire basis of our law, the immigrant who's being called illegal erroneously has every right to defend themselves. I'm not saying in these times that the immigrant should try and fight. I don't the people that are just leaving, I get it. I tell the people that are looking to go north, I'm like, just don't bother with the US. It's a fascist regime. Just don't. And I've been saying that for years, and now it's really coming down. But it's not because they don't have a right to go there. They do. And I keep hearing this thing where people say, we voted for this. This is our country. We get to decide. No, you don't. That's bullcrap. First of all, your country has a constitution. Second of all, you don't have the authority to grant government powers that violate human rights, and you never did. This is your country is not an excuse for slavery. It's not an excuse for genocide. It's not an excuse for imprisoning people without due process. You don't get to make laws. Those aren't laws for you Romans 13ers. A law is something that is natural and of the land and of people's rights. It's life, liberty, and property, and built around it. And anything that doesn't protect that, there's a lot of videos here on the channel in my law school stuff about this. Anything that doesn't protect it, and if you don't believe me, go read John Locke or Blackstone or the foundations from which modern law is built. A law that violates people's rights is not a law, it's a crime. Trump, when he makes executive orders and he orders people to be abused and denied due process and deported on planes and sent out of the country, it's not just a violation of the Fifth Amendment. When he holds up a photo that is forged evidence to try and turn an entire country against a person to deny them due process, it's not only a moral violation, it is a felony under USC 241 and 242, which make it a felony to violate people's rights under the color of law. See, everything the government is doing is a crime. And the churches and the people in the name of God, in the name of freedom, in the name of law are saying it's okay because they're the powerful ones with the guns. Therefore, they are law and you are slave. That's not how law works. That's the reason we write constitutions. Now, a lot of people say, well, the constitutions are useless. They don't protect us. That could be an argument. But the point is that every unified land is going to have some kind of codified rules because otherwise you could never actually sit down and arbitrate and give due process. It's just reality. That's why constitutions are written. And Carl says, well, then amend it. There is truth in that. If you said, hey, we want to change something, and you go back to women's suffrage, they didn't just say, we're just going to do it anyway. The government's just going to, the Congress didn't just make up stuff. They amended the Constitution, right? They said, we want this Constitution changed to match what we want. Now, does that mean you have a right to amend the Constitution to say that immigrants can't come in and that you can deport them without due process? No, it actually doesn't. You could theoretically amend the Constitution to say the federal government can manage immigration, but realistically what would stem from that are violations of the other amendments of the Constitution as we're seeing now. You can't say to someone, people say, well, they didn't have due process coming in, why should they get it going out? That's total BS. Due process is a rule for government and for the process of detaining someone and taking away their liberty of movement and locking them up. To do so, you have to give them due process, which is what? Fifth Amendment, a trial by jury, evidence. There's rules. These rules, they didn't follow the Constitution coming in. Why should we respect it since they didn't come here legally? That's total nonsense. That's just gaslighting. The Constitution is not rules for the immigrant. It's not rules for the people. It's rules for the government. That's all a Constitution is. But as usual, we write these constitutions and then we let ourselves be gaslight, manipulated, and algorithmed, whether you're the United States or North Korea, which are getting closer and closer together because Fearless Orange, he loves the tyrants of North Korea and El Salvador. Those are the kind of people he wants to emulate, not the kind of people he wants to oppose. The kind of people that can send people to death camps and prisons that they never leave with no due process, no appeal, and not even a phone call to their family. That's psychotic. And if you support that kind of crap, you're mentally ill. This is not natural. This is not how people thought when we were growing up. You have been quite literally, as I said in the other week's show, reprogrammed. But just coming back to this guy's, and I'm not really here to hate on this guy's video. This guy's video is very mainstream, churchy, do what we're told, follow the rules. But actually, if anything, despite the fact of him trying to be like, I'm going to kind of go down the middle here, every verse he found in the Bible was demanding that you treated the foreigner and that you helped them and that you treated them well. And then, sure, there was a little excuses along the way in Romans 13 and things like that, and there was a complete ignorance of what the Constitution actually says, and the fact that actually the illegal immigrant is not violating any law. They're not an illegal immigrant. It is illegal to require someone to be documented. Founding Fathers also said this when John Adams tried to do it with the Alien and Friends Act. Right? All this blow up came around the same time. And in fact, let's look at Madison's response in the Report of 1800 to what was happening with the Alien and Sedition Acts. If aliens, because this is another argument they use, if aliens had no rights under the Constitution, they might not only be banished, but even capitally punished without a jury. Now, you understand what he just said? He's using that as an extreme ridiculous. If aliens didn't have rights, they could even be banished or capitally punished without a jury or a fair trial. That's exactly what's happening and what we're currently celebrating in our society. That was his example of obviously it's not this way, because if that was the case, this could happen. And here we are doing that. But so far, has a contrary principle been carried in every part of the United States that except on charges of treason, an alien has, besides all the common privileges, the special one of being tried by a jury, of which one half may also be aliens. Notice this? Because you're supposed to be tried by a jury of your peers. So if you were a foreigner being tried, you needed to even have foreigners on your jury. That's how far they took this. That was the point of this, guys. I'm not saying the Founding Fathers had it all figured out. They didn't stop slavery, right? A lot of times they were elitist assholes. But they were very clear on the limits, the hard limits that were supposed to be put on government. And they made a process. This was the hard limit, and you could amend the Constitution. But no, an amendment, and somebody just said this in the comments, an amendment that violates human rights would not be legal. If you write a constitution, this is the thing. This is why constitutions don't give you rights. People say constitutional rights. That's bullcrap. They're not constitutional rights in the Bill of Rights. They are human rights. A lot of people didn't want them written in the Constitution. That's why they were added after, because agreements were made to do so. A few years later, the Bill of Rights was added. That's why they're amendments. It was the first 10 amendments, because in order to ratify the Constitution, a lot of the people to sign off on it in the states were saying, look, we got to have a Bill of Rights, otherwise we're going to get abused. Now, people that were against that said it's not about the rights. If we put the rights in there, they're going to abuse them anyway, and they're going to find ways to do it. And they said, no, it doesn't matter. If we're signing off on this Constitution and we're going to have a republic that we're members of as states instead of colonies, it's got to have a Bill of Rights. So that agreement was made as a clause between them, and they made the Bill of Rights. But it was very well understood that those rights were inherent. They were natural. They were God-given. If a constitution in any country, so a lot of constitutions have stuff that's total BS. The moment a constitution violates individual rights, it's illegal. And so people say, oh, well, you don't care about the Constitution either. Nope. I care about people's rights. I understand the idea of having your laws, your basic laws codified, right? But we all know it's illegal to murder someone. We still codify a law of what is defined as murder and what the punishment for it is in most places, right? I guess you could say that's logical, because if you're going to have a trial by jury for murder, whatever, you do need some kind of a process of how those charges work and why they fall under those charges. The Constitution is that for government. The Constitution is the law for them. And no one seems to understand this, but you know what? I think they do. A lot of them. The government certainly does. ICE certainly does. Trump certainly does, and his advisors. They just don't care. They want you to be that dumb and ignorant that you just keep believing them. And don't get me wrong, it's not like Obama and Biden and Bush weren't also abusing the immigrants. But you have to understand, and this is something that struck me on this video, is this man was speaking sincerely about, we need to love people, we need to be kind, but also, it seems reasonable that we don't just have an open border, that anyone can come in, because then too many people can come in. That's invented, guys. In our lifetime, that was invented. And a little bit before our lifetimes, okay? But this idea of a flood of immigrants came in, and there's too many, they would take over our culture. Nonsense. People were saying the same thing in the past. If you go back to 1912, I believe it was April 7th, 1912, in Ellis Island, New York, it was the largest immigration day recorded in Ellis Island. I think it was 12,700 immigrants came in one day. Now, all these people are saying if that many people come in, it's an invasion. No, it's not. An invasion is when people are violently trying to conquer you and take your stuff. Anything else is not an invasion. The words have meanings. Walls are for communists. People say, well, look at ancient Israel and ancient Bible. They had walls. There was some cities that had walls around them. You weren't restricted from entering the countries. This idea that you restrict people from immigrating is a very new idea. Sure, fascist regimes have been trying to do it for some time, but in any sort of a U.S. sense, this mostly came in the 70s and 80s. Before then, the border was pretty open. And before that, the border was completely open. This is why you never watch a John Wayne movie and he's crossing the border and he's never stopping to ask permission of immigration. This idea that you got permission just to go somewhere is a violation of human rights. No, people don't need papers. No, they don't need to ask permission. And no, you don't get to vote for that. You don't have the right to vote to take away the rights of someone else. You never did. It doesn't matter what your constitution that you made said. You don't have the right to tyranny. You don't have the right to tell people they need to apply to come to your country. And somebody says, yeah, but the Irish who are poor and dirty need not apply. Sure, there was lots of racism against the Irish. New York was a huge place. Imagine a city where you had 10,000 people immigrating a day. Now all these people would say that was an invasion. They should be sent to a concentration camp. So yes, there was some racism against these groups, but actually you didn't get denied en masse in Ellis Island. Ellis Island was illegal, by the way. The government had no authority to do Ellis Island. However, Ellis Island wasn't there to send 90% of the people home. It was pretty rare to get it rejected in Ellis Island. And the truth is, if you wanted to come in somewhere else where there was no restrictions, you could, and just come in another way. It wasn't hard to freely immigrate because it was an open border still. The ports of New York had a process, and it was a process that usually took a few hours. You weren't waiting years. You weren't locked away like a prisoner. You came in on the boat and you went through. It was just like going through customs and immigration, which, again, illegal, right? But I'm trying to make a comparison. Even though Ellis Island didn't actually have lawful authority to tell people if they could come in or couldn't come in reality, Ellis Island let almost everyone in. And generally, if they stopped somebody, it would be because they were sick or something like that. All of this current immigration stuff that preachers are repeating, that we're saying is the law of the land, we're saying it's always been this way. There's always been border controls. There's always been immigration restrictions. You always had to give permission. That's absolute nonsense. The founding fathers were outraged by the idea that an immigrant would even have to register. That's how extreme they were. That's the foundation. That's American values. All these people promoting deportations, repeating this propaganda, sharing these memes, they're willingly ignorant because they're full of hate, because the algorithms do their best to make us hateful. Even the people like Mike Winger here, who's looking at it saying, hey, I'm going to look at this from a biblical perspective, and actually coming at it from a pretty compassionate, reasonable perspective, are actually still promoting. They think the law is that you obey lawless rules that are actually violating the law. And so he's actually conflicted with his friends that are not documented immigrants because, like, oh, as Christians, should we follow the law? This is the problem when you take Romans 13 out of context and you use it as we worship government, we obey government instead of God. God says people have a right to live. He says you treat people with respect and you can't murder them, you can't kidnap them, you can't steal from them. Those are the laws. And anytime a government makes laws that violate those laws and says we can kidnap them, we can violate their due process, we can take their stuff, we can deport them, and we can kill them if they don't comply to our criminal acts, that's not law. That's lawlessness. And it doesn't matter if you're a Christian or if you're a Muslim. Anyone else notice something else? Here's something to chew on as we close tonight. Did you ever notice that before 9/11, none of us were talking about this Muslim thing? They weren't all terrorists trying to usurp our culture. You think that's an accident? Do you think the government hasn't had a direct hand? We're talking about the government who intervenes to overrule presidents and regimes in other countries so they can have control to better get money out of them and traffic their drugs. This is documented CIA stuff that was done under Hillary Clinton and under other instances. The U.S. is constantly meddling and committing crimes, just like they're doing today, to gain more power and control. War crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes against the Constitution. In every possible way, your officials are committing treason. And you say a poor guy who didn't get permission from these psychopaths to come and feed his family deserves to be treated like crap and denied due process because he didn't follow a rule that wasn't even legal in the first place. And just as you do this, think back, start using your brain. None of us, I remember the day, guys, I was there. None of us were talking about how Muslims were going to ruin our country, that they were all terrorists, that they shouldn't be here, that they were eating dogs or whatever crap we make up. I'm not saying there's not a cultural conflict there, right? But let's not get into that tonight. We'll go on too long. All that propaganda was created for you after 9/11 so that you would hate the people they wanted you to hate, ignore the crimes they were committing, and they could murder and rape and pillage for oil. Do you think those people aren't going to hate us now? Get serious. We were the terrorists. And they did a gaslight, which we fell for as a society. They literally went in, destroyed. Imagine someone invading your country, killing your family, and destroying everything you held dear, then turning around and teaching their country that you're a terrorist for resisting. If you believe that kind of crap, guys, you shouldn't be on Facebook. You shouldn't be preaching in a church. You need to disconnect and do some serious soul searching. Because if you're that ignorant, if you're that hateful, if you're that off the base of loving your neighbor as yourself, something's wrong. And I'm not trying to say that this guy in the video example I was using applies to that. I'm just saying that we're grossly misinformed. And you also cannot take just the religious context and say, well, that's the law, you have to obey it because this verse, and that's what the church always told us. No, that's nonsense too. The Bible, if that's where you want to go, upholds all of this stuff as well. And that all these things that are happening are lawless. That was my point for tonight. And as usual, I went a little long, but we've covered it. And I just always like to keep coming back and absolutely crushing these meme-based, ignorance-based, fascism-based, devil-based arguments that say it's okay. We're Christians, we're good people, we have compassion, but it's okay to abuse the weak, the fatherless, and the widow because of this, if you're here. No, it's not. End of story. Peace.